There are absolutely a lot of challenges to zoning and planning. And one thing we could do is, for example, change the zone or get a zone change. And the way you do that, it's a lengthy process, but you have to work with the city planning department and your engineering and your personal knowledge and figure out, is it worth pursuing? Because a lot of times there will be tremendous pushbacks and most zone changes are not approved, or there's a lot of pushback by the cities for a zone change.
Salim Development Group.
Welcome, guys. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Tahir Salim, CEO of Salim Development Group. Today, we're going to discuss evolution of land development. And we're going to talk about, for example, where should one be developing today versus where it was easier to develop throughout the United States, but now it's getting a little bit more selective. And we're going to discuss different topics regarding that. So first thing we're going to discuss is, how would you choose where to develop? Well, there are many factors, but the 3 or 4 really key factors I've realized, or I believe that you should know, is the approval process. So the development we're talking about, even though we're saying land development, we're really talking about business development as well, because they go hand in hand. And if you're doing a business development, that means you are in charge of opening a business, for example, a restaurant or a retail shop space of some sort. So it doesn't really mean specifically land development, but really business development combined with land development. If you're a landlord, you'll be looking at it from land developer side. And if you're a tenant, then you'll be looking at it from a business development side. So one of the key things we need to be mindful of is the approval process. The approval process is a very lengthy process. Getting approved for a restaurant, for example, restaurant with drive-through in California, it could take up to 3 years. So if you're looking for a land or a property, it may take you 3 years from the time you are negotiating, getting your building permits, or even opening. And the reason it takes so long is the cities are very, very difficult when it comes to approval process in California. And of course, certain cities are even more difficult than others. But 2.5 to 3 years is a very normal timeline. And of course, if you're working with someone who's very experienced, that time can be shortened a little bit. You could be avoiding pitfalls. But assuming a normal situation, you're looking at about 3 years. Now you switch that over to other parts of the United States, and that time could be cut into 1/3. So what may be taking, for example, 3 years in California may literally take 6 to 9 months in certain parts of the United States, because the entitlement process or the approval process is so much simpler, so much shorter. The cities are very, very, very easy to work with. They have less regulations, and their hours, much longer hours of operation or doing business. And lastly, some cities you're able to go and meet with the city officials very easily and discuss stuff over the counter, so far and so forth. So where you develop has a lot to do with how long it's going to take you to get your plans and permits. Next thing that matters a lot in real estate or business development is the land prices. Well, the land prices in California make it very difficult to develop. It's very expensive. But there are parts of the United States, Midwest, South, Northwest, or North, where the costs are easily be 1/3 or even lower. So if you're developing in California, you may be paying 3 times more for the same type of land. And in some cases, you might even be paying 10 times more. But you're paying typically 2 to 3 times more in California. Therefore, you have to have higher sales in order to break even and be more profitable. The third thing we should be very mindful of, which I've discussed in the past, of where you're doing business development, is California is very expensive. For example, for restaurants where the minimum wage is going to $20, while in other parts of the United States, you could be at $7.50 to $10. So picking where you do business development or land development, that is a very important point. And the last part that I think is very important to remember is the construction costs. The construction costs could be substantially lower from California because the wages in California are higher in general. And I guess I could add one more small part to that, is the availability of subcontractors and trades that will do the work. So if you're working in an area where there's such a high demand for construction or business development, then not only the prices will be higher because of supply and demand, but also it would just be difficult to find people to do the job. So some of the things I've talked in the past lightly, but that can make a difference or can mitigate some of the things, is AI order taking, cleaning. I've discussed it in detail in the past. Integrated drive-through system with AI, because if you have an integrated drive-through system, you can probably reduce one person in order taking. So that's a second item. Another thing that's very important is, for example, for a car wash, you can mitigate certain expenses. You can also get the cities behind you. For example, in a car wash, if you're doing higher recycle, and you could do 70, 80% recycle if your equipment's designed to do that, and it's working in proper manner, and the operations is there, so your employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing, you could be recycling 80% of the water. Not only does that save you cost, but also a lot of cities in California would absolutely like you to save as much as water you can, and that will go along with your entitlement process or permitting, plan approval. So anyway, the recycle is a very cool way of doing it. It could be very innovative. That will also add to cost. So you could be saving money on the water recycling part, but you will be spending money on additional equipment. Another thing we have touched upon in the past is solar panels. If you're using solar panels, you could mitigate some of your electrical costs. Electricity in California is more expensive than, for example, in Texas. We pay significantly more in California than we do in Texas. So if you are in an area where electricity is very expensive, you could offset some of those costs with solar panels. And the other thing that's very important to know is demand generation. That's something I will barely touch upon right now, but that's an additional cost the cities charge or the utility companies charge, which is not the amount of power you use, but just your demand. And there are reasons for that, and we could have that as a separate topic in a future podcast. So in addition to the things I've mentioned, for example, if you're talking about a business such as a car wash, you could be using license plate reader, which will allow fewer people to do the labor. It used to be in a car wash, when you drove in, you stop off at a window, and if you were a member, then let them know that you're a member. That evolved into something called RFID tags, and the RFID tags are something you put in a car. That car goes through the car wash lane, the gate automatically opens, but the problem with that was the RFID tags can be moved from one car to another, and therefore you may, as an operator, still have to keep an eye on the cars. Well, now it has evolved to even a higher level should someone be willing to pay the additional costs for the technology. And that additional cost would be for a license plate reader. So if there's a car that is a member in a car wash, then the car license plate can be read, and there does not need to be an attendant, and the car would just go through the gates, the gate would open, and the car is going to get its wash. The next thing I wanted to mention is a very innovative solution, which we have used as well in our last few construction projects, is security guard replacement. Basically, we are replacing a security guard with security cameras on site. And those security cameras are being monitored in a centralized location where a lot of different companies are sending their security camera data. So each site is not having a security guard. Instead, all the data or the camera footage is going to a centralized location for 20 or 30 different construction sites where one or two people are monitoring it, thereby cutting your cost down to 5 to 10% of what it would have been if you had hired a security guard. Very innovative and substantial cost savings. Like I said, 90-95% cost savings. So another success story I want to talk to you about we've utilized has been to meet the California water quality management. There's something called WQMP, that's water quality management protection. That is a requirement in California. And what we were able to do was to use that on one of our sites using percolation into solid ground, and that percolation allowed us to meet that requirement. That was very innovative. Such practices can be utilized throughout real estate development or business development of restaurants and other businesses. There are absolutely a lot of challenges to zoning and planning. And one thing we could do is, for example, change the zone or get a zone change. And the way you do that, it's a lengthy process, but you have to work with the city planning department and your engineering and your personal knowledge and figure out, is it worth pursuing? Because a lot of times there will be tremendous pushbacks, and most zone changes are not approved, or there's a lot of pushback by the cities for a zone change. And other times, if they are willing to do a zone change, they are requiring such a substantial amount of additional work that become cost prohibitive. The amount of time it takes to get a zone change gets added on usually to other plans and permit approval process. So if the zone change takes a year and a half, plan approval process is 2.5 years, it may not take 4 years. It may not add directly, but because there will be some overlap, but it may take 3.5 years. And there will be significant amount of complexity, and the likelihood of getting it approved through planning commission will be very difficult. Now, that does depend on which part of the United States you're in. There are other parts of the country other than California where the zone change is much simpler, much easier, and such situations, it may be worth exploring a zone change. But in California, it's not impossible, but it's really frowned upon, and it should be done at very, very case-by-case situation. Other than zone change, other challenges for zoning and planning is there may be a planner who just doesn't like your use, or you may have a lot of city residents who are against your use, and therefore you have to find other ways to get your project approved. And that's where having a tremendous amount of experience that we have has been very helpful. Besides myself, real estate development director and a project manager, so it's not just myself, but it's my team that we do this as a team. I lead the team, but we do it as a group, and it can be very challenging. There could be so many different roadblocks that come in your way for opening a restaurant or car wash or whatever we talked about. And each project is different than the previous project. There will be some similarities. There will be some overall guidelines or methodologies that we follow, but each project is separately and each project is different. So you cannot have a cookie cutter approach to business development. In addition to that, each city is different and personnel in each city are different. As I mentioned earlier, some are very helpful, and other city or county employees are just city or county employees, which are going to get their paycheck as usual, and their motivation is not always constant. So some city or county employees are a lot more motivated than others because of their own way of doing work. So that will also vary as well. Thank you for joining me on this week's podcast. I'm your host, Tahir Salim, CEO of Salim Development Group. Next week, we will discuss our new podcast, The Secret to Catalyzing Business Success. See you guys next time.
Salim Development Group.